Hey everyone, Steve Miller here with an Asia Now feature from the September 18th edition of Asia News Weekly. In this podcast, Human Rights Watch's Phil Robertson comments on the myriad of rights abuses in Malaysia and why it matters. As someone who has traveled extensively around Southeast Asia, if someone asks me about Malaysia, the first thing that comes to mind are the giant silver twin spires that are the Petronas Towers. Then I dive into fond memories of sitting on plastic stools, getting my fill of Penang's famous street food. But for many, Malaysia is a controversial location rife with human rights abuses. This week, I spoke with Phil Robertson, Human Rights Watch's Deputy Director for Asia. I started our conversation by asking him to paint a picture of what are some of the issues facing Malaysia today.
Well, there's a couple key parts that need to be understood. There's sort of the political sphere, and then there's the economic sphere, and of course they're connected. The political sphere really right now is revolving around the fight by Prime Minister Najib to survive a major corruption crisis, where it's been alleged by the Wall Street Journal and others that he received as much as $700 million in his private bank accounts. It's believed to have come from a thing called 1MDB, the One Malaysia Development Berhad. And he has now been fighting tooth and nail against critics, both within the government and his own party, as well as the opposition and civil society against those charges. And he has been using draconian laws such as the Sedition Act or 124B of the Penal Code, which talks about acts detrimental to parliamentary democracy, to try to intimidate critics. Connected to this, of course, is also a declining economic situation for Malaysia. The Malaysian Ringgit is weaker than it's been in a decade. It's fallen to below 4 when it used to be 3. There's concerns about inward investment. It is, like many countries, a export-oriented development model that is there, and they are focused on the competitiveness issue. But connected to competitiveness is also issues of government finances, and government finances are a big problem now. There was so much spending around the 2013 election and promises made to try to win votes that the major budget deficit in Malaysia is now being felt, and the government brought in a highly unpopular general service tax that was implemented earlier this year, and this has also really put the squeeze on people's cost of living. So it's a very, very turbulent political atmosphere, a government led by a political party, UMNO, that has been in power since independence in 1957, and a prime minister who, under threat, is now lashing out at critics using draconian rights-abusing laws.
And what about some of these laws? I mean, you mentioned the Sedition Act, but there's others that really stifle free speech and what citizens can do.
Yes, certainly. There are the Sedition Act. There's also restrictions on public assembly through the Police Act. So we have a number of people who are being called up for not giving the police adequate notice, 10-day notice for holding a protest. We have connections of the restrictions on printing and publishing documents. The guy who just won the CPJ, Committee to Protect Journalists Award, a cartoonist named Zunar, is facing 9 sedition charges for tweets that he sent out back in February after the federal court ruled that Anwar Ibrahim, the opposition leader, was guilty of sodomy and sent him to prison for 5 years. I mean, these are the sort of restrictions on freedom of expression and the media that we're seeing increasingly come forward. And now there's a proposal by the communications and multimedia minister to require the registration of online news portals. It's very interesting. The government controls the actual printed press, either through parties or directly through government institutions, but the when you look at the online press, it's much more free, and most people are getting information from the internet. And so that is something that the government is unhappy about. They're trying to stuff the internet genie back into the bottle and try to once again reassert control over what their citizens are able to read and hear.
Now, a lot of the focus these days is, well, squarely placed on Prime Minister Najib, but since he's taken office, we've seen a steady decrease in rights. But they all didn't necessarily go away once he took office. There's been a steady presence of rights abuses in Malaysia over the years, correct?
Well, there has been. We had the Internal Security Act that existed for years. And very interestingly, it was Najib that decided to do away with that. When Najib took power in 2008, 2009, there was actually some indications that he might be a bit of a reformer, doing away with some of these more draconian laws. Of course, bringing in substitute laws that were also problematic, but perhaps not as bad. And, I was saying back in 2012 that, perhaps Malaysia would see some significant progress in human rights. It could either go very well or it could go very badly. And unfortunately, it's gone very badly, where we've seen a real onslaught of sedition charges against the opposition and activists. And so much that Human Rights Watch has been busy over the last 6 to 8 months doing research and compiling a report that we're going to release sometime in October, talking about the criminalization of free expression in Malaysia.
Well, speaking about the criminalization, I mean, did the government just really charge a number of individuals for actions and protests that took place some 6 months ago?
Well, that's right. We had the Kitalawan protest. This was protest connected to the imprisonment of Anwar Ibrahim, the opposition leader, for sodomy, and people demanding that that conviction be vacated and that he be released. The government claimed that those people didn't provide necessary notice to the police in advance, and so they're charging him with that actual charge, as well as issues related to what they said at the rallies. This is the same group of people that were also involved in organizing the highly successful Bersih 4 protests at the end of August. And we don't think it's a coincidence that they have been brought up on charges for a previous protest when the government is so unhappy about what they were doing at the end of August, where you had over 300,000 people gather in the center of KL, many of them demanding the resignation of Najib and respect for democracy, human rights, and non-corrupt governance.
I think for many who may be listening to the podcast or even taking a look at Malaysia from abroad, when they think of the country, they think of the tourism, they think it's a relatively small country, some 31 million people, a gross domestic product of maybe $375 billion. Why would they care what's happening there? How does it reflect back to their personal concerns?
Well, I think that Malaysia, even though the population is relatively small compared to some of its neighbors, plays an outsized role in the international community. One of the reasons that governments in North America and Europe like to deal with the Malaysians is that they perceive Malaysia as being democratic, that it had regular elections since 1957 when it got independence, although one can argue that there are aspects of governance that are less than democratic in Malaysia, but it's broadly democratic. There's never been a military coup, which compares favorably to its neighbor Thailand, where the military are constantly interfering in politics. But I think also that they see Malaysia as a moderate country and a moderate Muslim country. So Malaysia becomes a very important country in debates at the UN, talking about the Middle East, where it can be a reliable voice to say, look, everybody needs to sit down, get back to the dialogue table, and figure out a way forward. That means that Malaysia is, has an important role in the international community, and it's a mid-level economy. It's an economy that is a growing economy, even with its most recent problems. So therefore, it's a country that much of the international community wants to do well. and they want them to respect rights, but they also want them to play an important role in the international community in dealing with the other sort of international crises around the world. That's why now in Malaysia, with Malaysia going sideways and backwards on human rights, there's a lot of different countries, particularly in Europe, who are scratching in their heads. They thought that Malaysia, in fact, was going to be a place they would see continued progress towards respect for rights. And watching it go backwards so fast over the past year and a half raises some fundamental concerns and also challenges some core presuppositions that different players had in the international community about how Malaysia was going to proceed. It's becoming a human rights basket case. And if you asked me 3 or 4 years ago whether I thought Malaysia would be in this place, I would say no. I would say that we would be focusing on places like Vietnam or Laos or Myanmar, where the human rights situation is still very grave. But now Malaysia is also part of the problem.
Well, let's turn that discussion to looking forward. I mean, you've already had to revise what you thought in the past about where Malaysia is today, and Human Rights Watch is conducting that research in the report that will be released next month. Where do you see Malaysia going?
Well, unfortunately, because of the ongoing political troubles of the Prime Minister, I think it's going to continue to go downwards on human rights. It's quite clear that Prime Minister Najib is prepared to sacrifice respect for human rights for his political survival. And, you know, the larger question is what is going to happen within the ruling party. I mean, as I mentioned, there is a debate going on. There are factions for and against Najib. There's a lot of concern that if he led them into the next election, which is expected in 2018, that UMNO could suffer historic losses because of the widespread perception that this is a corrupt government. It's hard to say what's going to happen next. I think that, you know, there's a sort of almost a catharsis going on now about the rule of a political party that has been associated with the government every step of the way since independence, and whether there would be change that would happen there. And if the change takes place, then other associated issues, because of course it is a multiracial, multi-ethnic country. And that is always the sort of boogeyman that is brought out by the government, that, you know, we're the only ones that can keep this all in order. And if we don't, then, you know, the Malays and the Indians and the Chinese will fight amongst themselves, and it could lead to potential violence. I'm not sure that's the case. I think that, you know, Malaysia is much more politically mature than it was back in 1969 when there were riots. But this is still the thing that the government constantly pulls back and places in front of the international and the national audiences, that, you know, we're the only ones that can maintain order. And no one wants to see Malaysia go down the road of a failed state. And in fact, Prime Minister Najib during National Day was talking about that. He was saying that I will not let Malaysia be a failed state. And the fact that we're actually using those kind of terminology for Malaysia, I think, is shocking to anybody who's followed the country for a while.
All right, Phil Robertson is the Deputy Director for the Asia Division of Human Rights Watch. Thank you so much for your time this week.
Thank you very much.
On this particular subject, I'd love to hear from you. Do you pay any mind to the state of human rights abroad, or must there be a personal connection to you before it becomes real? This episode of Asia Now features extended content of material originally broadcast as part of the Asian News Weekly podcast. If you enjoyed the podcast, please share it with your friends, and if you haven't, subscribe. Subscribing is free, and when you do, the next episode is delivered automatically to you. You can subscribe on our website, asiannewsweekly.net, or in your favorite podcast application. You can also keep up with more news from the region by following Asian News Weekly on Facebook or Twitter. And if you have any comments, questions, or feedback, please drop us an email message. That address is podcast@asiannewsweekly.net. Thank you so much for joining us, and until next time, remember to be true to yourself and to always be awesome.